The sound of combustion doesn't lie. When you hear the screaming turbocharged wail of a flat 12 engine pushing 1,100 horsepower through a car that weighs less than 1,800 pounds, you're hearing something that fundamentally changed motorsport forever. This is the story of the Porsche 917/30 Can-Am Spyder, a machine so relentlessly, overwhelmingly fast that it didn't just dominate a racing series. It killed it. And the driver at the wheel of this mechanical apocalypse wasn't just any racer. He was Mark Donohue, an engineer with a racing license who understood that speed and science were the same thing. By 1973, when this turbocharged monster took to the circuits, everyone already knew what was coming. Porsche was going to win. The only question was by how much. To understand the Porsche 917/30, you first have to understand the culture of Can-Am racing in the early 1970s. The Canadian-American Challenge Cup was the Wild West of motorsport. There were virtually no rules. You could run any engine displacement, any configuration, any power output you could get out of your machine. It was a series built for mad dreamers and brilliant engineers willing to risk everything in pursuit of speed. McLaren had owned this sport since its inception in 1966. Bruce McLaren, Dennis Hume, and an endless parade of McLaren drivers had won 5 consecutive championships by 1972, thanks largely to massive all-aluminum Chevrolet V8 engines producing 800 horsepower or more. It was a McLaren world, and everyone else was just trying to survive in it. But then Porsche showed up. Not with just another racing car, with an idea. While the Europeans had dominated the endurance racing world with the 917 at Le Mans, winning back-to-back overall victories in 1970 and 1971, that series' new 3.0-liter displacement restriction meant the 917's legendary 4.5-liter flat 12 would soon be obsolete in Europe. So Porsche looked west. They looked at Can-Am, where bigger was better and more power was the only measuring stick that mattered. But how do you compete against 8.0-liter FEV8s, producing north of 800 horsepower when your engine is already proven at 4.5 liters? You turbocharge it. In November 1972, after months of development work by legendary engine boss Hans Mezger and engineer Valentin Schäfer, the Porsche 917/10 first fired up with 2 turbos bolted to its flat 12. It produced around 850 horsepower. That was revolutionary. Nobody had successfully integrated turbocharging into a road course racing car before. But it was also just the beginning. The challenge with early turbocharging wasn't just getting the boost, it was managing it. Turbo lag, that delayed response when you step on the throttle, was a notorious problem. The turbine inside the turbocharger needed to spool up to a certain speed before delivering boost, which meant drivers had to deal with sudden, unpredictable power surges that could spin the car around in an instant. The Porsche engineers solved this by introducing a wastegate, a bypass valve that controlled boost pressure and made the turbos manageable. It was elegant engineering, but only one man really understood how to extract the maximum from this technology on a race circuit, and that was Mark Donohue. Mark Donohue wasn't just a racing driver. He was a mechanical engineer who graduated from Brown University with a degree in mechanical engineering before he ever seriously competed. He had spent his racing career learning how to set up his own cars, understanding suspension geometry, aerodynamics, engine tuning, everything. When he first got into a turbocharged 917 in testing in 1971 and 1972, he didn't just drive it. He helped develop it. He understood turbo lag in a way most drivers never would. He could feel the car's behavior and communicate exactly what changes needed to be made. At the 1972 Can-Am season opener at Mosport Park in Canada, Donohue climbed into the 917/10 Spyder and immediately broke the lap record by 4 seconds on his first attempt. 4 seconds. That was a statement. Porsche ended 1972 with George Follmer winning the Can-Am Championship in the 917/10 after Donohue was sidelined by injuries. But everyone knew what was coming in 1973. Everyone could feel it. The revolution was about to begin. For 1973, Porsche took everything they'd learned with the 917/10 and evolved it into something unprecedented. They stretched the wheelbase by 184 millimeters for better stability. They refined the aerodynamics. They increased the displacement from 4.5 liters to 5.4 liters, and they pushed the turbochargers harder. The resulting 917/30 was, and this is not an exaggeration, the most powerful racing car on Earth. In race trim, it produced 1,100 horsepower. In qualifying trim, with the boost turned up to 39 psi, it made over 1,500 horsepower. That power was distributed through a car weighing just 1,800 pounds. The numbers were completely detached from reality. The power-to-weight ratio was 1,369 horsepower per ton in race configuration. In qualifying, it jumped to nearly 1,967 horsepower per ton. For context, a modern Formula One car produces around 1,050 horsepower and weighs about 798 kilograms with its driver. The 917/30's power-to-weight advantage was so extreme that modern F1 cars would look slow by comparison. And nobody, not even Porsche, knew exactly what the engine was capable of. Mark Donohue famously said, "It's the only car I've ever driven that can spin the tires at 200 miles per hour." He meant it literally. When the 1973 Can-Am season kicked off at Mosport Park in June, everyone was waiting to see if the 917/30 would actually live up to the hype. Donohue qualified the car on pole position and set the fastest lap. He won the race. At Road Atlanta the next race, Donohue was on pole, fastest lap, race winner. Same story. Pocono, Road America. 3 more races, 3 more poles, 3 more fastest laps, 3 more victories. By the time the season was halfway done, the conversation wasn't about whether Donohue would win. It was about whether anyone could even finish within a minute of him. The only 2 races Donohue didn't win in 1973 weren't because the competition was close. At Mosport, he ran off the road and had to pit for repairs, allowing Charlie Kemp's 917/10 to win. At Road Atlanta, a fuel valve burst, drenching Donohue in high-octane fuel and forcing him to pit for water. Those were the only 2 races he didn't win. But even in those races, he set pole position and fastest lap. Even in defeats, he was the fastest driver on the circuit. He won 6 of 8 races and claimed the Can-Am championship by an impossibly large margin. The 917/30 didn't just win races. It redefined what was possible on a circuit. At Road America, Donohue qualified 3 seconds faster than the next quickest car. 3 seconds. That's not a tenth of a second improvement, which would be considered massive in motorsport. That's a 3-second gap to the second best car in the field. On most road courses, that kind of advantage is the difference between first place and fourth place. It was dominance so complete that it bordered on embarrassment. The car could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 1.9 seconds, from 0 to 100 miles per hour in 3.9 seconds, from 0 to 200 miles per hour in 10.9 seconds. It could reach a top speed estimated at 260 miles per hour. In 1973, when fuel consumption mattered, Donohue raced it at 1,100 horsepower. That was enough. That was always enough. The rest of the field was left watching Porsche's rear wing getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared over the horizon. To understand why this was so revolutionary, you have to understand the state of competition before the 917/30 arrived. The Can-Am series had always been about McLaren V8s and American engineering. The idea of a European flat 12 turbo engine beating the McLarens wasn't just a surprise, it was a shock to the system. But there's something deeper here. The 917/30 wasn't just fast because it had more horsepower. It was fast because Porsche understood that turbocharging on road courses required more than just brute force. You needed finesse. You needed engineering. You needed someone who could drive with the precision of a surgeon and the courage of a fighter pilot. You needed Mark Donohue. But even as the 917/30 was reaching its absolute peak, The world outside the racing circuit was changing in ways that would prove catastrophic to the series' future. In October 1973, just weeks after Donohue's championship-clinching performance, OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other countries that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices skyrocketed. Gas shortages became commonplace. Suddenly, a race car that consumed fuel like a B-52 bomber wasn't just a competitive advantage, it was a public relations disaster. Porsche had actually already constructed 3 additional 917/30 chassis for the 1974 season, but they were never completed. The company wasn't going to participate. The series wasn't going to recover. For 1974, the SCCA responded to Porsche's dominance and the oil crisis by introducing a fuel consumption limit of 3 miles per gallon. That's not a suggestion. That's a hard cap. The turbocharged 917/30 couldn't meet it. In the one race the 917/30 competed in during 1974 against cars that had been fitted with much lower boost levels or naturally aspirated engines, it struggled. The age of the Can-Am killer was over, but before it ended, Mark Donohue had one more statement to make. In 1975, after taking a sabbatical from racing to pursue a Formula One career with Roger Penske, Donohue returned to the 917/31 final time for an attempt at the world closed-course speed record. Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama, with its 2.66-mile oval, was selected as the venue. Donohue and Porsche had one goal: to see how fast this car could actually go. The engine was modified with a smaller 5.0-liter displacement, but intercoolers were added to the turbochargers, which meant the power actually increased to 1,230 horsepower. Porsche performed 120 seconds of full-throttle testing on a test bench before they felt comfortable with the reliability. Even they didn't know if this engine could handle flat-out driving on an oval for multiple laps. On August 9, 1975, Mark Donohue climbed into the 917/30 and simply drove. He completed a lap in 43.3 seconds, averaging 221.16 miles per hour. During the run, he reached a maximum speed of 237 miles per hour. The old record was shattered. The new record stood for 11 years. Let me repeat that: 221 miles per hour on a closed course in a race car from 1973. That record stood for 11 years. Modern hypercars, with their advanced aerodynamics and traction control systems, have struggled to beat that number by meaningful margins. The 917/30's top speed record is one of motorsport's most enduring achievements, a testament not just to the car's engineering, but to Donohue's courage and precision under extreme conditions. At full speed, any mistake would have been catastrophic. 1/2 degree too much steering input and the car goes into the wall. One miscalculation and the engine, running at maximum stress for the entire run, could have exploded. But Donohue didn't make mistakes. He was an engineer and a driver, and when you combine those two skills in a man of exceptional talent, you got something like this, a record that lasted over a decade. The tragedy of the 917/30 story is intertwined with the tragedy of Mark Donohue's death. Just 10 days after setting the speed record at Talladega, Donohue arrived in Austria for a Formula One race weekend with Roger Penske's team. On August 17, 1975, during warm-up for the Austrian Grand Prix, Donohue's March 751 suffered a tire failure. The car careened through an Armco barrier and trackside signage. Donohue was knocked briefly unconscious, but seemed relatively fine. He climbed out of the wreckage, complained of a headache, and went back to the garage. Within hours, the headache worsened. He was rushed to a hospital, where doctors diagnosed a brain hemorrhage. They operated, but it wasn't enough. On August 19, 1975, Mark Donohue died at the age of 38. 2 days after a crash that seemed minor. 2 days after setting a speed record that would last 11 years. 2 days after proving that he was the greatest driver-engineer of his generation. He was gone. Roger Penske was devastated. The two men had been partners, friends, and collaborators for over a decade. Together, they had created the 917/30. Together, they had dominated Can-Am. Together, they had set a speed record that still stands in the annals of motorsport history. When Donohue died, something broke in Penske. He continued to race for one more year, long enough for John Watson to win the Austrian Grand Prix in 1976, giving Penske Racing its first and only Grand Prix victory. But then he pulled out of Formula One entirely. The dream died with Mark Donohue. The 917/30 continued to exist. A few chassis were preserved, restored, and eventually ended up in private collections and museums around the world. One chassis sold at auction for $4.4 million in 2018, making it, for a time, the most expensive Porsche ever sold. But the car never raced competitively again. Its time had passed. The era it represented, when horsepower was unlimited, when fuel consumption didn't matter, when a brilliant engineer and a fearless driver could build a machine that was simply too fast to race, was over. The 1973 Can-Am season was, in many ways, the last gasp of a certain kind of motorsport. It was the final season before regulations became so restrictive that outright power and innovation took a back seat to rule compliance. It was the last year of unlimited turbos in Can-Am. The 917/30 won 6 of 8 races, set lap records everywhere it went, and fundamentally changed how people understood turbocharging and forced induction. When the technology proved so dominant that it threatened the viability of an entire racing series, that's when you know you've created something truly special. That's when you know you've transcended racing and entered the realm of engineering legend. The 917/30's legacy extends far beyond Can-Am racing. Porsche took the technology it developed in the 917/10 and 917/30 and brought it to the road. In 1974, just months after the 917/30's Can-Am dominance was winding down, Porsche introduced the 911 Turbo, the first turbocharged Porsche for the road, with 260 horsepower. It was a direct descendant of what Mark Donohue and the Porsche racing team had developed in the Can-Am series. The engineering, the wastegate technology, the boost pressure management systems, all of it came from the race car. Porsche would go on to become synonymous with turbocharging. Today, the company still uses the turbo badge on its most performance-focused cars, and it even puts the turbo name on some of its electric vehicles as an homage to that heritage. All roads lead back to 1973, to Mark Donohue, and to a car so fast that it had to be stopped by the rulebook. What made the 917/30 truly remarkable wasn't just the horsepower figures, though 1,100 in race trim and over 1,500 in qualifying was absolutely staggering for 1973. It was the package. Porsche, under Ferdinand Piëch's leadership before he left in 1972, had built a car that was not just powerful, but balanced. The longer wheelbase compared to the 917/10 made it more stable at extreme speeds. The refined aerodynamics meant that all that power could actually be put to use without the car becoming a dangerous missile. The turbochargers, properly tuned and managed, delivered their power in a way that could be controlled by a skilled driver. This is what separated the 917/30 from being just another horsepower fest. It was intelligently engineered. Every cubic centimeter of displacement, every PSI of boost, every component existed for a specific reason. But perhaps the greatest testament to the 917/30's dominance is the simple fact that it forced change. The Can-Am series had been running successfully for years before 1973. There were competitive cars, close races, and champion drivers. But the moment the 917/30 arrived, everyone knew the series was finished. It couldn't recover from this. The combination of Porsche's engineering, Donohue's driving, and the fuel crisis meant that 1974 would be a pale shadow of what Can-Am had been. By 1975, Can-Am was running with fuel consumption restrictions so severe that it became uncompetitive. By 1976, the original Can-Am series simply ceased to exist. The series died not because the competition was getting worse, but because one car was so impossibly good that it killed the competitive balance overnight. That's a hell of a legacy for a machine. When people talk about the greatest race cars of all time, the 917/30 rarely gets left out of the conversation. Alongside the Ferrari 250 GTO, the McLaren F1, and the Porsche 956, the 917/30 occupies a place in motorsport mythology. But unlike those other cars, the 917/30 has an extra dimension. It wasn't just a great car that won races. It was a car so fast that it literally changed the rules of an entire sport. It was a car so fast that it created the need for fuel consumption regulations that didn't exist before. It was a car so fast that it ended a successful racing series. It was a car so fast that it required one of the greatest driver engineers in history just to be operated effectively. Every other great race car can point to its victories and championships. The 917/30 can point to its dominance and say, "We were so good they had to stop us." Mark Donohue was only 38 years old when he died. He had accomplished more in his racing career than drivers who lived to twice that age. He was a mechanical engineer who understood his craft at a level that is rare, even among engineers. He was a racing driver who could operate at the absolute limit of car and human capability without losing control. He was a collaborator who worked alongside mechanics, engineers, and team owners to extract marginal gains that eventually added up to massive advantages. He was, by any reasonable definition, a genius. The fact that his greatest achievement, the 917/30 in 1973, came just 2 years before his death makes it all the more poignant. He never got to see how far the technology he pioneered would go. He never got to drive the next generation of turbocharged Porsches. He never got to watch the 911 Turbo become an icon that would define a brand for decades. He set the speed record on August 9, 1975. He was dead by August 19, 1975. His life was cut short, but his legacy never faded. The Porsche 917/30 and Mark Donohue represent a specific moment in motorsport history. A moment when engineering innovation was allowed to run wild, when power was the only measurement that mattered, and when one man and one machine could truly dominate everything around them. It was a brief golden age of anything-goes racing that probably couldn't exist today. The regulations are too strict, the oversight is too tight, the financial risks are too high. But for one season, 1973, it did exist. And we got to see what happens when a car that's too fast to control and a driver who's smart enough to manage it come together on the same circuit. The sound of that 5.4-liter turbocharged flat 12 wailing at 8,000 RPM is one of the most distinctive noises ever heard on a racetrack. It's a sound that motorsport fans who were alive to hear it will never forget. It's a sound that exists now only in archival footage and historical recordings. But every time a Porsche is turbo, that sound echoes forward from 1973. Every time someone pushes a turbocharged engine to its limit, they're echoing what Porsche and Mark Donohue discovered when they built a car that was too fast to race. And that, more than any trophy or championship, is the eternal legacy of the 917/30. A car that didn't just win races. It changed motorsport forever.